Hi, this is Jim from Trek World, and today we're going to take a look at one of the many things that never quite happened in Star Trek. In 1987, Paramount Pictures briefly considered reimagining the USS Enterprise as a CGI-only model going forward. So join me today as we take a step-by-step analysis of this Trek not taken. No, amazingly enough, in today's age of gaming consoles and smartphones with more raw compute power than all the personal computers built in the 1970s combined, it's easy to take CGI for granted. But it wasn't always that way. Let's take a look back at a time where the future of computer animation was still to be forged. And to do that, we need to take a brief pit stop in 1955. Now, why the history lesson, you might ask? Because, believe it or not, the very first instance of a computer graphics in a major motion picture was Alfred Hitchcock's 1955 masterpiece, Vertigo. And this modest piece of computer animation was created by a mechanical computer that weighed 880 pounds, had 11,000 moving parts, and took 5 people to operate. Now, as you can see, the effects were quite striking for their time. They actually even look good today. Even today, 70 years later, the basic premise of this mechanical computer is still present in a child's spirograph toy. Now, the average Gen 1 Star Trek fan is probably just geeky enough to tell you that the earliest computers were actually mechanical computers, which featured gears and levers rather than electrical components. For example, this is a Curta calculator, built in 1948 originally as an alternative to the ubiquitous slide rule. It had an extremely compact design and was considered by many to be the very best portable calculator that money could buy until the mid-1970s, when it was finally replaced by an electronic calculator. Now, as we make our way up from the 1950s, we're going to go through the 1980s, and we have to stop there because there's a very key event for Star Trek, and that was Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Computer animation took another huge first in that movie. It was the very first time a fully textured 3D environment was shown in a major motion picture. And of course, I'm talking about the Genesis device. The video that we see here within Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, even to this day still looks good. And most of us can clearly remember exactly how amazed we were when we saw it on the screen. Now, most Gen 1 Star Trek fans can remember that we were quite young when this movie actually came out, and how impressive this video sequence was for its time. As such, it's pretty obvious at this point in time that Industrial Lights and Magic was behind it, although some of the people that were there at ILM would later move on to Pixar and take this technology even further still. And now we've reached our destination. The year is 1987, and Star Trek is about to make a triumphant return to television in the form of a brand new TV series entitled Star Trek: The Next Generation. Now, as a result, the Star Trek production team wanted to explore the possibility of using CGI only for all the new shots of the USS Enterprise. To evaluate this, they asked a series of special effects houses to conduct some animation tests and then submit them to review. Now, obviously, the constraints that these houses would have all fell from delivery, quality, and expense. And last but not least, if it didn't look good on the screen, there'd be no point in doing it. Now, to give you an idea of how the process works, the one you see on the left, that's an early wireframe that shows the overall 3D motion of the object that's going to be rendered. And then they automatically take that information and they do the one on the right. Now, in the case of these software houses, they had no final ship designs for the NCC 1701D that they could use. So Paramount told them instead, let's use the refit, NCC 1701A. Now, the first test that we're looking at right now is an example of one of those low-textured, low-quality mock-ups to let us see how the ship would basically react. In this clip, we actually see the Enterprise coming around the backside of a planet in orbit. And now we're going to take a look at a series of renderings, each one being a little bit more advanced than the previous one. The first one you see here on the screen right now is a pretty basic shot of the Enterprise firing its phasers. And the next rendering adds even more details, as you can see here, and picks up immediately after the firing of the phasers. And then lastly, in the final rendering pass of the shot, they added even more detail yet, and they also included 2 photon torpedo launches just for good measure. Now moving on to a different set of clips, we can see a basic flyby in orbit here. Notice the lack of high-resolution details. For instance, as the ship pulls away, you can actually see the rear observation windows, but you can't see through them. Whereas in this next pass, we see more detail has been added. Look at those observation windows now. Now in this shot, there's been a couple of rendering differences from previous ones. One, the red glow on the insides of the nacelles is no longer visible. And as the Enterprise goes by and we look inside the observation windows, we can now see the room that's behind them. Now this is pretty much the exact same shot, but now it uses multi-point lighting. Notice that we're casting a pretty substantial shadow of the bridge on the saucer. And if you are a Gen 1 Star Trek fan, this shirt is more than just a piece of fabric. It's a badge of honor. And remember, if you're a Gen 1 Star Trek fan, you're not just a fan, you're Star Trek history. Now going back to where we were, in this final shot, we see the fully rendered model. And when I overlay this photo of the physical model of the Enterprise, you can see the quality differences between CGI and practical effects back in the 1980s. But there were also other reasons for not going with CGI at the time. Namely, the expense was actually going to be pretty great, especially considering the amount of time and the number of computers that it would take to generate the final animated renders that you needed for the film. Additionally, if any single part of the rendering process failed for a piece of hardware, you could be set back weeks and therefore delay production. And then finally, they were very concerned about what if we put all of our eggs in one basket? We give this business to this one company and the company goes out of business. What do we do then while we're making this TV series? This proved to be an extremely prophetic statement because guess what happened? One of the companies did go out of business. It would take another 6 years until 1993 that the TV series Babylon 5 would choose to use CGI only for its special effects and models. And even then, at the launch of the series, it took 24 Amiga 2000s with video toasters 45 minutes to make a single frame of animation. So for every second of film they needed, 18 hours to render. And finally, as a true Star Trek fan could tell you, it would be 2001, 14 years after the 1987 tests, before Paramount would in fact choose CGI only for its models with the launch of the NX-01 by Doug Drexler in Star Trek Enterprise.